I'm Kevin Ormsby. I'm the program manager at, Charles chose his name, Cultural Pluralism in the Arts Movement Ontario, CPAMO for short. And it's really an honor to invite you for the first panel and gathering for the fall, and for it to be focused primarily on IBPOC women. I think, and especially IBPOC women in the arts or in the arts sector. I think when we first spoke about what this gathering was going to be, I was like, oh, how are we going to? Oh, that's actually very interesting and timely, given all that we see and all that women have done in the arts sector from time. It's primarily a woman-centered field, and I think sometimes under-recognized for that. So I'm really excited to see what comes of the day, what notes we take, and how we take them. Before we move forward, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. I think it's important as an immigrant to this land to actually honor the land in which we're on, whereas it's a site of human activities over 15,000 years, and that it's the home, historically, to the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Mississaugas of the Credit River, and also to many others who've also migrated to this particular space. I like to, when I do my land acknowledgement, actually broaden it to the space of the Western Hemisphere. I'm Jamaican by birth. Hamaka, which is the Taino name, it's actually a traditional space, indigenous space as well. And for me, as an immigrant coming to this land, I have to understand that I count my privilege in it, because indigenous bodies in this land probably do not have some of the opportunities that I do. And so it's really humbling for me to arrive in this particular space and to think of it as a space of opening, to think of it as in the indigenous concept, the idea of caretaking the land, caretaking of yourself. So during the panel, if you have to leave and go somewhere and do what you need to do it. But also that we be in regard with everybody else in this particular space, and continue to think about the spaces outside that we're caretaking and honoring of cultures and traditions are also important as we move forward into what Canada should really be. If it was that, we wouldn't have spaces and organizations like CPAMO, and we should be honest about that as well. Welcome. We're here for the first panel, and we have Ilene Sova, who's a board member, will be the moderator of the panel. We have Alica, we have Marjorie Chan, Karen Tisch, and we have Zainub as well. Verjee, there you go, who will be the key sort of persons to animate the space and to titillate the mind. And of course, our panels are never normally formal. So I want to also encourage you, halfway through, if someone has mentioned something, it's a conversation, right? And that's why we also have it so much. We're possibly in a circle, because we feel that in a circular space, the information is shared, the knowledge is knowledge in the room that is passed around in that particular space. So without further ado, welcome. Before I do that, I want to create space for the ESL interpreters to ask a particular question as well.
Hi. So, as Kevin said, my name is Ilene Sova, and my position is Chair of Drawing and Painting at OCAD University. And we're also going through this transformative change. We just announced yesterday that we're doing a Black cluster hire. So if you know any Black academics who are interested in a tenure track position, we have 3 positions coming up. So we're doing very similar work in the university sector as these amazing women are doing in the arts and cultural sector. So I was very honored to be asked to moderate this panel, especially when I read the bios of these phenoms. I really want to decolonize this space and, as Kevin said, make it very casual, have lots of interactive conversation. I don't want it to feel like expert panel and passive audience. I'd like people to just raise their hands and get involved, because we're all here to learn and to try to transform our spaces in this city so that we can include everyone's stories and narratives in our artistic production. So we were just talking casually before we started, and Karen would like to go first. So Charles, our executive director of CPAMO, has asked that each person speak for about 5 to 7 minutes, put some provocative ideas into the room so that we can start the discussion going. So each of them are going to do that, and then we'll open it up to the floor for back and forth. I have some questions. I've been writing for a few days and very excited to ask. So I do want to read a little bit of a bio. I know that everyone has an electronic program that they might have gotten over email, But I think when we're introducing particularly women of color, we need to acknowledge their work, acknowledge their achievements, and really speak to what they've done to get to where they are. So I'm going to read little mini bios of each panelist. So Karen Tisch is the executive director of the Koffler Gallery and developed the Toronto Arts Council Equity Framework. Ms. Tisch is a veteran arts manager, programmer, and consultant with more than 25 years of experience in the Canadian arts sector, including executive positions at the Ashkenazi Foundation, Hot Docs, Canadian International Documentary Festival, Images Festival, and the Toronto Arts Council. Ms. Tisch began her role at the Koffler in March. So I'm going to pass the mic for your provocative.
Oh, I don't think I'm very provocative, but I'll say a few things. So thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to CPAMO. So as was mentioned, I'm the new executive director at the Koffler Center. I wanted to go first only because I actually have not been working within an arts management position for a while. I've been working in policy work, particularly around equity and diversity. So I thought I'd probably take more of a bit of a policy overview, kind of look at it from that lens, whereas everybody else has been working, on the ground, and I'm sort of back on the ground after some years of absence from that arts management world. I guess I just wanted to stress, first of all, that although in recent years the struggle for equity in the arts, and particularly women of color and Indigenous women, has been especially visible within mainstream discourse, and this is as a result of things like the Me Too movement, the publishing of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report, the implementation of the AODA, the very highly public debates that have occurred recently around the issue of cultural appropriation. But I wanted to stress that the work of promoting equity and inclusion has been going on for a very, very long time. And specifically that the work in Canada was very much rooted in progressive movements in the 60s and the 70s that promoted women's equity, civil rights, gay rights, Indigenous rights, disability rights. So all of these various movements really are the predecessor. And I think that the efforts around equity in the arts really galvanized around the late 80s and early 90s, where we saw artists of color and women at the very forefront of that, and as well as Indigenous and Black and Indigenous artists promoting, advocating for more space within cultural institutions. And this led to things like the creation of the Equity Office of Canada, the Council, and then the Aboriginal Office shortly after. And it also led to a huge amount of activity within the community, and a lot of organizations were founded at that period. So, Desh per Desh, there was the Invisible Colors conference that Zainub invariably, I'm sure we'll talk about. There was Writing Through Race. There was the Yellow Peril exhibition. There was the Racial Equity Fund, which was based here in Ontario. There was the formation of the Black Film and Video Network. So there was so much activity that focused on the issues of racial and cultural equity. And some of those organizations are no longer exist. And I just wanted to start there because I sometimes find that when we talk about equity in the arts, there's a tendency, at least among perhaps more mainstream organizations, to forget that there's this long history of activism and struggle. And even among young activists, to sort of forget that we're standing on the shoulders of, not that I'm young anymore, but those for you who are young, that we're standing on the shoulders of a lot of work that was done in the past. A few years ago, I moderated a equity sounding for the Canada Council. I worked with the Equity Office of Canada Council for about 6 years, on and off, and it was an interesting event because it brought Black and people of color and Indigenous artists and artists with disabilities from across the country to try to talk about the state of the arts in terms of equity. And since then, I've been sort of reflecting a lot on, what's happened since the 90s? Like, have we made progress or have we not made progress? And so I thought maybe I could just tell you a few things that were on my mind vis-a-vis that. So I mean, obviously what we're seeing is a lot more BIPOC artists are on stages, in print, in galleries than ever before in the past, which is, of course, fantastic. We're also seeing more people in management positions, in artistic leadership positions, like some of the women on this panel, as artistic directors, as curators, as general managers. We're also seeing a lot more recognition of diverse artists' work. I mean, the last month alone, Giller Prize, both the large prizes of the Writers' Trust were taken by artists of color. The OAG Awards, the organization that Zainub runs, recognized a lot of Indigenous and people of color at their recent award ceremony. So we are seeing more recognition. And we're also seeing, of course, a growing demand for diverse works among audiences, in large part because of the shifting demographics. And artists of color, Black and artists of color, and Indigenous artists are also really at the forefront of linking Canada to markets around the world, because they are connected to so many different lands. So they're linking Canada to the Middle East, to Latin America, to South Asia, to East Asia. So we're seeing a lot of progress in that regard. And I've also observed that there's a lot of solidarity between equity communities. Again, not new, because this was happening in the, back in the 60s and 70s, but I have seen a coming together of a lot of different communities, be it Indigenous communities, Black and people of color, queer communities, transgender communities, and so forth, and talk of the whole notion of intersectionality, which is something that we all have been familiar with for a long time, but has never been articulated perhaps as clearly as in recent discourse, in terms of the kind of compounding of systemic barriers that people experience as a result of being part of different minoritized communities. So I think all of those things have been really challenged, great. But the things I'm still sort of seeing as major challenges is, well, first of all, I think racism is still very much alive in Canada, in the arts community. It takes sometimes more subtle forms than in the past, but we're still seeing a lot of stereotyping, we're still seeing tokenism, we're still seeing cultural appropriation. And we're still seeing, I would say, just a general devaluation of particular artistic practices, which are sometimes, considered less sort of professional because they're rooted in particular cultural communities, or less important because they are rooted in those communities. I also find that, although things are starting to change with new leadership, I'm going to say mainstream organizations for a lack of a better word, though I hate that word because we're all part of the mainstream, but I'm going to just use it because I don't have another better word. But I find that mainstream organizations are still often making very perfunctory gestures towards equity. For example, programming one artist of color or one Black artist or one Indigenous artist in a season and sort of feeling, okay, diversity has been checked off. We can't possibly show two works by, say, two South Asian artists. We can show 5 works by white artists, but we can't show 2 by South Asian artists. That would be just outrageous. So I'm noticing that there's still that is in play, and I'm also noticing that everyone's doing land acknowledgements, but oftentimes there's nothing beyond the land acknowledgement in terms of, I think the land acknowledgements are really important, but I sometimes get frustrated because I see organizations doing land acknowledgements, but they're not hiring or showcasing Indigenous artists, and they're not really reaching out to Indigenous communities to make sure they're in the theaters. So they're basically giving the land acknowledgement to a very homogeneous audience. And I also see sometimes where, smaller companies are taking a lot of, say, culturally diverse companies or Indigenous companies are taking a lot of artistic risk. And it's often only after a piece has been fully developed that a larger company will come in, take it, and then we'll get a lot of attention for that piece that was actually developed for the last 5 to 10 years by a company that has very little resources, like in the theater world. So these are some of the things that I'm still kind of noticing. I'm also noticing that cultural spaces haven't changed very much in terms of who has access to cultural spaces and facilities. And sadly, statistics are still showing that artists of color, and particularly women of color, are continue to be remunerated at a much lower level than their white and male peers. You'd think that we've made a lot of progress in that regard. I mean, our pay equity kind of, struggles that we've been going on for years and years and years. But in the arts community, there's still this disparity. And finally, I'm still noting that a lot of mid to large size organizations, their boards are still primarily white. I mean, even the organization I've just started to work on, where I'm starting to now recruit other people because it is a largely white board. And likewise, faculty of training institutions, although I'm really encouraged by OCAD's recent, I've never heard the word cluster hire, but it sounds almost rude, but yeah, cluster hire of for Indigenous, 5 Indigenous profs. That was very promising, and now I hear a next step. So that's very promising because the training institutions are still not reflective of the diversity of the Canadian population, and it means that artists of color are not necessarily getting the kind of training, culturally sensitive kind of training, and training in their own artistic forms that they should be. I'm going to maybe just have 2 more minutes. Is that okay? Yeah. So I guess all this leads me to think, well, what is required to really embrace equity within the arts world or in the Canadian arts context? And I think we need a deeper commitment from arts institutions and organizations that do possess funds and human resources and venues and facilities. Virtually every arts institution that you hear of right now is saying that diversity is a priority. But what I'm sometimes finding is they want diverse bodies within their system, but they don't necessarily want to completely share power. They want their organization to say the same. But the difficulty is that when you bring in a lot of people from different communities, the organization invariably has to change. And people are not necessarily up for that change. They're still sometimes resistant of that change. So they want the diversity. They want to say, yes, we have a diverse staff or diversity on stage, but they kind of want it to stay stagnant in some way. And this to me is really not about equity. And Nina Factory at the Toronto Arts Awards, she did not mince her words when she said that organizations have to cede power. They have to actually allow people of color and Indigenous people and Black artists and arts professionals to take the reins, and then they really have to move over and allow those people to take the organizations in new directions. That I think is really, really significant. Let's see. The other thing I wanted to just mention is I've been noticing people are hiring, I'm talking about institutionally, people are hiring more people of color, Indigenous people, and particularly women. But I often find that they're not as supported as they should be once they're in the organizations. And I'm talking to women all about this all the time. They're working they finally kind of penetrated these institutions, but then they're feeling isolated. They're feeling marginalized. And this is particularly true of women who are often branded as too loud. They're trying to make change within institutions and they're branded as troublemakers and they're sidelined. Much more so for women than men, I find. So I think the ingredients that I've noticed for success, when I've been working with institutions, because I've been doing a lot of work around helping institutions build equity policies and plans, and I recently did the plan for the City of Toronto's Culture and Economic Division, and I did the one for the City of the Toronto Arts Council. And I find when I reflect on when does it work, when does change happen and when does it not? And I've noticed a few ingredients. First of all, organizations have to publicly declare that equity is a fundamental part of their organization. They have to embrace equity at all levels of the organization, not just at the staff level, but at the board level as well, and throughout. Volunteers, everyone. It has to be a priority and a shared responsibility. They have to invest in equity training. anti-racism training, but also training in Indigenous cultural competency and training around disability rights. Like all of that training has to happen. They also have to set realizable goals and actually track their progress towards meeting these goals. And they have to invest money and people power in making change. I also think it's really helpful if people actually report on their progress and are self-reflexive and say, well, this really didn't work, but these are the things we're going to do and taking the steps. So I'm talking mostly about mainstream or more mainstream organizations and change, but I'd like to stress as my last final point that I think even organizations that are run exclusively by people of color or Black people of color or run by Indigenous people, I think equity processes are important within those institutions too, because oftentimes because they're working with one marginalized community does not necessarily mean they're fully inclusive of other marginalized communities. For example, are they being fully inclusive of deaf and disability communities or transgender communities? I find that I've had to do a lot of learning. I come from an anti-racism background. I've had to do a lot of learning to understand all of the complexities of the issues that are faced by Indigenous artists, by artists who identify as deaf or disabled. And so I think it's a process that we should all be engaging on. And I also want to say that I think it's really important that in addition to kind of making systemic change in the larger organizations, that we properly support organizations that are culturally specific and that are Indigenous organizations. Because the reality is that despite like the new funding models and all the promise of that, money has not really shifted dramatically. The majority of our arts funding is still going to Eurocentric arts organizations. And it's the Indigenous and culturally diverse companies that are often taking the greatest artistic risk and really developing work that's reflective of our population.
Great, thanks for that list. Before I move to the second person, is there any pertinent questions on your mind now that you wanna ask, just to respond as we're going? Because I find otherwise we kind of forget what that person said by the time we get to the last person. Anything sticking out? I have a question if no one else does. So actually you covered the first two questions that I had written down when you were listing off your points. So I'm going to dig a little bit deeper. So my question was about the much harder problem to develop diversity and equity is the collective will within the organization. So I've been in organizations where we do the anti-oppression training, we do the truth and reconciliation training, but always the people coming to the table are the ones that are kind of there already. So how do we drag those other people kicking and screaming to the table so that we can really make the deep changes? Do you have any advice?
That is really hard. It's a really hard question. But one of the things I think when I said that I think everyone needs to take responsible for equity, sometimes I think what happens is that only the people of color, the Black people of color and Indigenous people within an institution are tasked with actually moving equity forward. I think that's a huge, huge mistake. Like, I actually think that, oftentimes people develop committees or they sort of say, okay, these are the people who are going to be responsible in moving it forward. It has to be a truly multicultural and diverse group of people. Because I think assuming that the task of accomplishing equity should be done only by people who are more minoritized or marginalized within a system is just a disaster. So that's the first thing I would say. It is really hard because it's really about changing minds and hearts. And I think the other problem perhaps is that we can't rely on a single 3-hour workshop. People go to a 3-hour anti-oppression workshop and you think, well, you've done it. And I think there needs to be a much more comprehensive way of looking at how to train people around these issues and sensitize people. So, I often recommend a very sustained kind of process of professional development, which would include lots of visiting speakers and so forth, to have people come in, talk about their lived experience. I find that often it's people's stories of what they experience that are often most effective when they're just told, please make these changes. They're like, it's not necessarily in my interest. But when they start actually hearing stories of people and how their experiences of working within systems, that they start to sort of develop that kind of empathy that's required to actually take it from kind of the intellectual step of the organization has to do this to this is a benefit. This is a benefit to me, and it's a benefit to all of us to have this diversity. So that's a hard question. I don't think I answered it.
You want to answer that as well?
I do agree that a lot of the conversations that are happening are with people who are already at the table, are already engaged, are already comfortable with these topics. And I think that there is this climate in which that we live in where we expect people to really quickly understand the issues that we're talking about when we've all been educated, socialized in environments that teach us the exact opposite. And we continue to use language to this day that reaffirms that. So I just think yesterday I was in a conversation or a discussion with Canada Council, and someone talked about the fact that their company focuses on the classics. And I was like, yeah, the classics. So their entire organization's understanding of their work is that their work is foundational to what everyone understands as the first, theatrical productions that we all should know and understand. They're classics, right? So I think there's we create environments within organizations where people, have 3 hours to reorient themselves around what could have been 10, 20, 30 years of a way of understanding the world, their work, their relations to others, and there's not this ongoing dialogue and space to actually articulate, things that I think take a long time to understand, oftentimes people use AOP as you've been through the training. I don't understand how you don't understand this. And it's like, what? And there's also privilege within that. A lot of folks, I feel like for myself anyways, a lot of these principles that I learned was in university. And so while the internet has a wealth of information and resources and videos, I think to truly internalize equity and realize how your existence and your work reproduces systems of power, it's an ongoing iterative process, and organizations and staff and volunteers need to create spaces that allow for that ongoing education and not expect that,
So my little presentation, it's very short, and it builds and aligns with a lot of what Karen has just said. And you might hear some repetitions, so please pardon me for that. So I broke this down into sort of 4 areas. So it's women in the arts, or women leaders in the arts. And I think it's really important for us to understand the history of movements that have brought us to this space today. Us sitting here, making the kind of land acknowledgement that Kevin made, us listening in this really beautiful, circular space, where we try to break down the proscenium wall and try to break down the very structures that create those power relations. And also, I can't seem to unlock my phone, which from where I'm reading, and pardon me, I'm just not a digital native, and I can't figure out how to take it off auto lock after 30 seconds. So anyway, I wanted to focus on women for a minute, for a long time, but if we understand the Canadian context and the history of feminism in this country, the national status on women, the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, went to the Royal Commission with a set of recommendations that included giving more power to women in all kinds of ways. And the Royal Commission rejected these recommendations. So I'm talking about this in the 1970s. That rejection actually created so much unrest. It created a rising, as it were, of feminism in this country. It led to women artist-run centres being formed, to women's studies being created in universities. It led to so many different types of things. So you can see how the failure of one policy led actually to the making of a whole bunch of other things. And it actually gave women in this country a whole new space, in a way, in different platforms, to come together and to have conversations. And the reason that and you'll see at the end why I feel it's really important to talk about these histories, because a lot of what happens to us is erasure. The erasure through colonization, through erasures of modernism, repeat, divide and rule, let's erase this history. And I'll just take one quote that I really love. It's that the struggle between memory and forgetting is the struggle for power. So what are we told to remember, and what is embedded deeply into memory as cultural memory, and what we are told to forget is actually the struggle for power. And it's happening to us in our own groups, in our own organizations. Sorry, that was really awkward. Sorry. I'm sorry about this part. I don't know why. So anyway, and I think that what happened in that policy failure moment was that women saw an urgency and found their agency and made things happen. Now, where did race come into this? And how did race and gender work together? And I think there were many fights, and intersectionalities happened a long time ago. Karen mentioned quite a few events, and they weren't actually events. They were more than events. But I'll focus on one which I was leading. It was in 1989, and this November was its 30th anniversary. It was Invisible Colors in Vancouver, which is where I lived. I was a distributor at Women in Focus, which is an artist-run center that distributed women's film and videos. And what we noticed was there was no work by women of color. It just wasn't anything. And we were like, where's the work by women of color? And actually, when I went to Women in Focus for my interview, I said to them, you're a feminist organization created in the 70s and you've never hired a woman of color, and you need to. And that needs to be me. And they gave me the job. Anyway, very quickly, I realized that there wasn't any work by women of color, and I'd met Marjorie Chan, who was also doing publicity with the National Film Board in the Pacific region. And we got talking, and we said, let's create a little event. Let's try and find work by women of color in this country. Let's bring it to Vancouver. Let's do this little thing. And then this little thing became actually one of the most important to date film and video festivals for women of color, third world women, globally. Globally. This history of third cinema and all of these things actually starts in Algiers in the 70s. Montreal was, doing stuff. Studio D had been created. Nothing, and women had been, in all these historical things, women had been completely left out. This was the first time, and we went from, let's do a little thing, to creating this international event within an 18-month period, raising $500,000, bringing works, more than 110 works with a school program, a symposium, and women from all over the world, from Africa, from India, from Havana, from Latin America, name it, came together for this money. And this happened in this country, in Vancouver. Nobody knows about it. Why? It's got written out of curricula. It's got written out of, etc. You talk to young people and they've never heard of it. This year, I decided I'm rewriting it back into history. And I was invited to speak for 1 hour at a keynote at the Courtauld Institute in London about this event. And it's just been put out in a book by Diana Bowen called Other Places. And so in the education system, it's very important that these things come back. I mean, I talk to young people who don't know about AIDS, and it's like, because AIDS isn't taught, right? You know, we've just had World AIDS Day. So know your history. It's really important, because if you don't, then if you do, let's put it this way, if you do, the work that you will do will be much stronger. And you won't be reinventing the wheel. You will have ways to seek out the people who can give you the knowledge and you know, transfer that knowledge and learning to you. Because we are knowledge keepers now, you know, in our field. Anyway, let me move on. Leadership, governance, you know, this is about creating change in organizations. I think really a lot of tension that occurs in our organizations around these issues is the management and the governance level. And you know, Karen articulated in slightly different ways and she's right, and like those changes occur not in 3-hour workshops, and you know, we need you know, the whole sort of idea of diversion and inclusion has actually, diversity means just all kinds of people, just bring them, it doesn't matter, now we've ticked it, you know, we've got 10 this, 4 this, 2 of that, we're done. Power hasn't changed, right? And what's happened in this highly neoliberalized, individualized society that we live in is that we're just looking after ourselves, and we are because at the height of capitalism, the diversity is only a way to increase our profits. So that's why those things are brought in. And Deloitte is a perfect example. If you go and look at their diversity and inclusion, your mouth will drop. Like, what? Anyway, the other thing that I've learned through the people that have mentored me and all the amazing women that went before us is that you have to keep at it. You have to keep going. Our work will never end, right? And which is a good thing, because we have something really important to work for then. It brings meaning to the work that we do, actually. I have the privilege of working at the Department of Canadian Heritage at the Arts Policy Branch, and I went to, we were allowed to go to the public school, Canada Public School, and one of these sessions was leadership and change in culture. And General Hillier, do you guys remember Rick Hillier? He was our Chief of Defense, really took care of Afghanistan and what Canada was doing there, 2005, 2008. These people are probably the most powerful people in the country, right? And they have lives in their hands. People's lives. So this is warfare. It's very strategic. You make one wrong strategic move, you know, and if you tell your army go there and not there, and you haven't thought this through properly, your people will literally die. So huge respect, not that I'm for war or any of those things, but this man came to speak. And the one thing that he said that really struck me, and I try to practice it on a daily basis, one of the things that he said was, to be a good leader, you need to know and be very aware of what assumptions you're making. Think about those assumptions. More than that, you need to know even what are the assumptions that you don't know you're making. Now imagine practicing that every day, because if you're just thinking about the assumptions you made, I've addressed all my assumptions, but there'll always be something that you didn't think about, that you've made assumption on, and it could put somebody's life in danger. And that actually has really helped me think, helped me personally to think through things when I do my daily work. And I always pass it on to the interns that come to work with me, and we do exercises about what are the assumptions we're making in anything, you know, that we're taking on. Now, how does one really change a mission of an organization? I think everyone here is going to speak to it. We're going to have a huge conversation about it. And there's many ways, and I've done many things. I am the executive director of the Ontario Association of Art Galleries. you know that art galleries and museums' core mandate is to collect colonialism. And imagine they hired me, right? I'm having fun, folks, because I really, at the core of my work is to change their missions and mandates. But that's not easy. What's my time? How am I doing? Couple of minutes. Okay. So I won't get into the details of what I've done in my work. That'll be fun, and we can talk about it later. There's just a couple of things then that I'd want to say then, if I've got a couple of minutes, yeah? I think that, when we're talking about change, there's so many different ways that we can impact a person on a daily basis, through our boards, through the work that we do, through the programming that we do. But at least in this country, what really we need to change is the very seat of power that is recreating the very systems that we were fighting. And I'll speak from a policy framework because I've done policy work. What needs to change in this country is the mother policy document, which is known as the Massey-Levesque report. That is the report that created all our cultural institutions based on the 2 founding nations. Indigenous is not part of it, never mind people of color. And until that document is not rewritten, the national consciousness of this country will not change towards what we are looking for. So find it. This is urgent. I'll go back to this is urgent, and it needs agency. It needs us in solidarity to rise again and fight for this massive change, because when that changes, that's when real change can be implemented in all the institutions that we work in. I have fought for, so I'll just give you another thing. I was born in Kenya in the Mau Mau movement. The Mau Mau movement was the movement that created, that fought British colonialism as a freedom movement. And I was brought up in the Calabar. People think that just existed in South Africa. So my whole history has been highly racialized. My entire work's career has been about race and gender. And I know that until the Massey-Levesque report is not rewritten, we won't really be able to rock this country in the way that we need to. Right? And we need to be, you don't even hear words like solidarity, it's all diversity and inclusion. What happened to affirmative action? What happened to solidarity? Now we're seeing it globally. Look at what's happening in Chile. That woman who holds the poster up and says, neoliberalism started here and this is where it will end. Women are taking to the streets. Women are singing out of their windows in curfews. We have a lot of power. We need to find it together and come together. That.
Again, I'll put it out to the audience and see if anyone has a pressing question. Yeah, Andrea?
That was fantastic, thank you. I'm curious about that report, if you can tell us again what it is, how to spell it. I want to look it up.
Yeah, so, sorry. The policy document, it's called the Massey, M-A-S-S-E-Y, Levesque, so L-E-V-E-S-Q-E, report, and it's basically, it was the document that was written to create the policy that separated us from the South, but also based on the 2 founding nations that went on then to create the Canada Council, the National Gallery, and all the other national cultural instruments which are under I think the Heritage Act or something, Museums Act or something. I'm talking visual arts in this particular instance. But it's that report that if you read it, it's just really fun to read because you can just start critiquing it immediately, right? It's just the language, right? So.
Cool, thank you.
I was curious to know, you mentioned being dedicated to anti-oppression essentially for a while. And as someone who I guess works in equity and arts for social change, I notice that there's loops that people can get caught in. Is there a loop that you see the community gets stuck in? Because we can be so meaningful in the way we want to create change, but we don't realize that we're just back in a cycle? Are there any cycles you hope to see broken in 2020?
Yeah, that's such a good question, and I think that today's conversation is really about that. For me, in a way, I know later on there's going to be another panel, and I know that one of these panelists is very new in the job, and they're going to speak about, I spoke about this as well, is that like, what I think is really missing and why we keep getting caught in these loops is that when we are not passing on our knowledge properly, right? We are not being able to come together in ways that we need to. I think that the idea of solidarity is broken, and it needs to be brought back. And it's through that you learn from all the different facets of the loops and vortexes that you can get into and how to avoid them, right? So I don't want to just say it's management and governance, because it's beyond that, actually. It's about how we can really, and I'm not saying we have all the knowledge. I think young people have immense knowledge also, right, that they can give to us, and we need to be able, we have to listen, we have to be open to it. I think as the conversation go on, I may come up with some other more concrete things, and definitely let's talk afterwards, yeah?
Thank you. So now we have our third speaker, Marjorie Chan, who's the Artistic Director of Theatre Passe Muraille. Marjorie is a multidisciplinary theatre artist working as a playwright, librettist, director, and dramaturge. A 9-time nominee, Marjorie is the recipient of 4 Toronto Dora Awards, 1 for Outstanding Performance and 3 for Outstanding New Opera. In 2005, she was named the K.M. Hunter Theatre Artist, an Ontario-wide award for mid-career artists. In 2017, she was awarded the George Lescombe Mentorship in Theatre Award from Toronto Alliance for the Performing Arts. Marjorie was previously artist-in-residence at Banff Playwrights Lab, Cahoots Theatre and Factory Theatre, Theatre Direct Canada, Tapestry New Opera, and SUNY Geneseo, New York, and the Theatre du Pif in Hong Kong.
Hi, everybody. Really lovely to be here. It's a little chilly, so if I jump up and down a little bit, it's just because I'm a little bit cold. First, I just want to give a little bit of context of who I am. As you mentioned, I'm the Artistic Director of Theatre Passe Muraille. That's a new position. I started there in July. I was previously the Artistic Director of a culturally diverse theatre company called Cahoots Theatre from 2013 to 2019. I myself, I was born in Toronto to immigrant parents that came from Hong Kong. I just want to acknowledge the fact that I'm of a particular ethnicity that's Han Chinese. Probably the Chinese people that you meet, 99.8% of them are probably also Han Chinese, because that's the most dominant ethnicity over millennia in China, and it comes from the subjugation of indigenous peoples in that land that we call China. So I also want to acknowledge today the sovereignty of the Tibetan people. Just in terms of that context, in terms of the kind of work that I do, previously, as I mentioned, I was at Cahoots Theatre. A lot of that focus of the work of that particular theatre company was in culturally diverse and in supporting culturally diverse artists. And in the time that I was there, really we were able to, what I call, really put a breath into that mandate and extend that and really start to pay attention. What does it, as Karen noted, like coming from an anti-racism background, okay, who else is not included? Who else whose voice is not being shared on the stage and not being part of our processes? So a lot of that has taken me to a lot of work in disability arts community, as well as with deaf artists. And so that's just to give you some context of that. Okay, I'm Gen X, so I have a notebook and an iPad. Okay. as mentioned, Charles had asked us, oh, and please, he said, please be provocative. So I said, okay, fine, I'll be provocative. The title of my, ersatz talk today is called, Okay, Boomer, the case for radical change starting with young people. Everyone's like, haha, that's funny, is it? No, people are like, it's ageist. Yeah, okay. So just to articulate that we're kind of looking at how do you make sectoral change, how do you dismantle outmoded systems and structures, and I think it's clear you have to, we've talked about that, you have to have major shifts in leadership, and you have to change the way of power the structure of power. And so we've all been at that, or maybe we haven't, but we've all been at a kind of EDI workshop, and we've seen this pyramid, yeah? So it's a pyramid of a very hierarchical organization, and in it we see, okay, where do the people of color, where do they enter? And we see that most of the triangle, this pyramid, is primarily white, and as they begin their diversity hires, you see that these new hires, often, most likely young people, often women, coming into that organization at the bottom of that organization. And at the bottom tier of that organization, it's like, oh, white people, like, well, there's like quite a few, kind of maybe 50% that's generous, maybe, like at the bottom tier. And then as you go up, there's fewer and fewer people of color, and as you reach the top third, there's none, right? So we've probably seen that image before. Just to like put that image in your mind, like for me, not only do we understand that then the people of color do not have the power in that kind of structure of organization. Not only that, but also they're bearing the load, right? That they're all there bearing the weight. And so I like to think of that, and certainly we understand that they not only cannot leverage any power that they do have, but they're also trying to hold the weight. And maybe it doesn't need to be said, but I'll say it anyway. So what is that weight? What is that burden? So if you are, a person of color in an organization, you're one of the few people of color, persons of color in that organization, you'll understand that professionally you will automatically become some kind of de facto diversity consultant on professional matters within that organization. I think people are starting to recognize that just because you have a black person in your organization, you can't think, and what do you think about it? And that happens professionally a lot. I think we understand that. I think the other part of it that I think is maybe less obvious and less, harder to kind of really quantify or understand is how that impacts people socially, right? That also, especially, in particular, I'm talking about young people and the young people at that young tier that's brought into that organization. So say there's, I'm making this up, say it's Susie and she's Latinx and she's in her 3rd month of employment and she's in the break room and she's having her lunch and minding her own business. And a group of her colleagues come in. They are maybe a tier or two above her, again, in this very hierarchical pyramid structure. And they're just having lunch as well, but they're having a conversation, and they're talking about some popular culture. They're talking about Don Cherry or something. I'm just saying. And suddenly they start to realize they may be, and they're perfectly friendly, lovely people, and they kind of realize, oh, wait, Susie's here, and she's Latinx. And suddenly then the attention is on Susie and how Susie might feel about that. And that might be framed in a lot of different ways. It might be just like, oh, do you watch hockey and like whatever. But it also comes down to how is Susie possibly going to answer that question? Like, how is Susie possibly going to speak in that conversation in a way that she still feels comfortable in her employment? And all those power structures are really subtle, but really important. All that to get me to the place of I'm really an advocate of how you can give people, especially younger people or emerging artists or administrators who traditionally in a hierarchical structure would be at the bottom of that structure coming into an organization, how do you give them positions of power? How do you give them power immediately? Okay? If you really want to have sectoral shift, you really need to think about that and think about where power, where people with disabilities, people of color, and the environment in a position of power, the culture will change. Especially if the organization is open to it and the organization can be open to that change. I just use this just as an example. In 2015, Theatre Passe Muraille and Cahoots Theatre produced a play by a playwright, a deaf playwright named Adam Pottle. He was, I think, 26 at the time. He was a novelist and a poet. He'd never written a play before, but we committed to producing his play with 2 deaf actors. The theatre companies, Cahoots Theatre and Theatre Passe Muraille, by virtue of that experience and by virtue of taking that risk, which is, by risk I say it's like, it was a $125,000 production. And for companies of our size to do that was a commitment. And from that, those 2 companies have been fundamentally changed. And I can say that as leadership of one that left that from there, and then now at Theatre Passe Muraille, that they have fundamentally changed their perspectives on deaf culture, how we work with deaf artists, how we work with more deaf audience members to bring them in. And that's one shift. But that is putting that playwright, that voice, the artistic lead, in a position of power to be able to do that. There was an article, so back to young people, there was an article not too long ago that proposed that every executive or high-level management position that was for people who were over 45 needed to have a corresponding mentor who was under 25. Not a mentee who was 25, not someone they were mentoring that was 25, but someone who could mentor them who was under 25 years old. I just thought, this is amazing. And I actually proposed to take that even further, to say that, okay, what happens if you put a 25-year-old in charge of an organization? In the UK, we've seen this at a number of theatre organizations, some of them quite sizable, where there's been a lot of leadership change in London, and primarily from artistic directors who are retiring. And so they have now put several artistic directors who are under 30 or well under 30, and I know in at least at one case was 25 when they were appointed. So in the ecology of it, in the theatre ecology in London, that's a shift that people were making. Okay, I know, and then let's go and say, wait, what happens if you put a 25-year-old in charge of an organization? What happens if they don't have experience? What happens if they fail? What happens if, yes, okay, just hang on, okay, cool, so I just want to talk a little bit about experience. I want to talk a little bit about experience because I think if an organization is genuinely trying to shift the way that they're thinking and the way that they're operating, then by nature of that, the person that you hire will not necessarily come with the experience that you already have. That experience that is in the same outmoded system that you're trying to get from under. So if that's the case, then you could be looking at a young person that doesn't have this formal experience that that position you would normally be looking to. They might have different experience, and they might have different lived experience that's going to bring value to your organization. And I think that one people are like, no, but they need to be able to do it, and what do you think? It's like, okay, I'm like, give them the job, give them the confidence to be able to run that organization, right? I'll continue on. Again, it's really to consider that maybe their experience looks very different on paper than what it is that you've normally done. What you've been doing hasn't been working, so maybe you need to change it. Okay, so when we say that, if we hire a 25-year-old, you still want to give that 25-year-old the environment to succeed, and I think that's a really critical part. And what does that look like? a lot of people said, oh, training. There's lots of leadership training programs. Leadership training and all this training. Ask me how I feel about it. No. There's a little bit for me that gets my back up, because training has been historically for women and for women of color sometimes an obstacle to the hiring, right? So, they lack the experience. So we've talked about experience already. Oh, if they lack the experience, but if they have the training, maybe they would be qualified for the job. So that is fairly common historically, that's been, twigs me a little bit, because it has been a barrier to hires, right? Or an excuse. And say, well, you didn't hire that woman because they didn't have the right training, they didn't have the right experience. All that to say, I'm not adverse to actually training in general, but how about if the messaging is that we think you're terrific, we think you're amazing, we're going to hire you, and we're going to train you in this aspect that's needed for the job. So then you give the person the confidence of having the job, and you provide the support in order to be able to do the job properly. Then that leader has that confidence of the organization. And again, to me, what other ways? We can talk a lot about ways, and I think further into the afternoon, talk a lot about the ways in which, talk a lot about the ways in which we can create that environment of success for that particular person. That could be really meaningful mentorship, and it is often, how you have the board buy-in that has to be all in order for that organization to shift, right? So we've talked about this environment to succeed. Here's the next part. The company has to give that leader the environment to fail. So they also have to do the other thing, right? And that's because we know this. A woman in a new position of power, a woman of color in a new position of power, really is not. In some ways, their chances are they're given one chance. They have to succeed immediately. Otherwise, they're judged critically. They're judged critically within the organization, within the community, in a public manner, right? Everything is dependent on immediate kind of success. And we don't see this. We don't see this with our white male colleagues. And that's the truth, that they get second chances, third chances, fourth chances, fifth chances. Ella's laughing. She's thinking of someone in particular. I don't know who. But that they get multiple chances to try things, do things. And so how can we create an environment where women who are in positions of power are able to take risks? So that means the possibility of risk means also the possibility of failure. And I would say that if that culture is not there, then that artistic leader, or whoever that leader is not at the forefront of their work and not at the forefront of their practice. Because if they're not willing to take risks, or if they're too afraid to take risks in that environment, that organization will become stagnant in no time, right? And it will not work, right? So not, how that happens is something else. That requires a larger culture shift. And so what happens? What happens if they do fail? And what is the support within that organization with something that has failed? And I think that's really important, that again, that has to be a company buy-in. There has to be a patience and a support to be able to really begin that shift and begin that change. So I think that's it. Really, if you're, I kind of jokingly say this, like if you have a commitment to hiring more women, hiring more people of color, hiring more Indigenous people, hiring people who are deaf, hiring people with disabilities, it's the answer is like very simple. It's like give them a position of power and support them so that they can do the work. And I lean into the experience. And I think if your organization is open to that, your organization genuinely, in all good conscience, wants that change, then they just need to lean into it and do it. That's it. Thank you. Kevin?
Sorry. I did not want to intrude at all, but can I have you? We have a problem. It's a good problem to have, but we're at capacity. Oh my gosh. So,
Come on through.
Diane will come through. And I could say this moment just to break. Diane is one of our featured artists at the art exhibit that's being hung at Bathurst now in 8 till Friday. And she's also Indigenous background. Amazing work. So
Thank you.
it's a good little segue for programming happening at the next space.
You don't make me feel humble now.
I feel like these chairs are like colonial thrones. Victorian salon.
Yeah, we get the
panelists.
This is wrong.
Does anyone have any questions for Marjorie?
Thank you so much. I know you are also being provocative, but what about the not fully developed frontal lobe of 25-year-olds? And what about women of color that are older? Like, why does it have to be a 25-year-old that's in the position of power?
Yeah, I am being provocative. I was on that too. I don't even know what you're talking about in terms of the frontal lobe.
The brain development isn't fully there at 25.
But their ideas are there. The creativity is there.
But
their experience. What does that mean?
So the executive.
I'm being really provocative. What's that mean?
So the frontal lobe. You can Google it later.
Yeah.
I'm not a doctor.
That's
I'm
okay.
an
Okay.
artist.
I'm not trying to understand.
I'm not an expert on the brain.
No.
But the frontal lobe, they used to say 25, not fully developed. Then they started saying 35. Now they're saying it may never even be fully developed. But 35 is the number they're going with now.
That's a big subject.
For your brain to be developed in terms of executive skills and like being an adult. Like the reason why a 10-year-old wouldn't have
What
an
are
apartment
those?
or drive
So
a car.
that's my point. What are those skills?
Well,
what are those particular skills?
That would have someone,
Yeah.
I guess,
And-
judgment, like to drive a car or to an apartment or something. It's not there when you're 10.
Organizations that have been started by people under
Yes.
25.
Yes. So I guess I'm questioning what actually those skills are. Who's making that framework? Who decided that in terms of brain development? And so I'm just also questioning those things as well. Yeah.
I really loved that, but I do think, we were all 25 when we did what I talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I wasn't this age, right? And I do think you have to make room, and I work with really people all under 30, and I bring in people that are all under 30, and I can tell you that I have learned so much from them. And the first thing I say to them is, you have a place here to work, and I want you to bring your ideas, and we're going to listen to your ideas, and we're going to implement them. We're going to see how we can implement them. And I take them to that exercise of, this is what it needs to actually have a vision, but then you have to operationalize it. And the other thing is that you also mentioned, and I had it in my notes, but I didn't get to the risk part. That was the last part of my talk, was actually in an organization you have to budget for change, but you have to budget for risk. Mm-hmm. You have to put in that $500,000 to bring in somebody, for example, and pay for that. Because unless we start actually putting the money, we have to be very risky. We have to eat risk for breakfast and not be risk averse.
Wendy, you had a question?
There's a lot of mention about being provocative, and I think for the Indigenous, Black, and racialized women in this room, what you're saying is not necessarily provocative.
Exactly.
It is our lived experience, and one of the things I'm grappling with is that I attended today because I was looking forward to a physical space that centers Indigenous, Black, and racialized women. And we are in a space where there are white and white passing allies or working in allyship that are physically taking up space. So I just want to take a moment to be provocative and encourage women of color, racialized women, Indigenous women, Black women who are sitting at the back to take up space, and I would encourage folks who are white and white passing to give up their space so that they can be centered here. because it's distracting me. I have to say, it's distracting. Like, I came to a space that I was hoping would center, and physically, and like emotionally and spiritually, and I'd like to have us create that space now.
I'm happy to give up my space.
I
if,
am too.
Yeah.
I am too.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I don't actually, I understand that comment, but I don't think it's gonna get us anywhere.
Where do we draw the line? Like, I'm a first generation immigrant,
So am I.
but I am white Passe. So like, where do you
Yeah, I
draw
think
the
that's good.
So once we get a time, I think there's an invitation here for a dance to happen. And before we go into the rebellion for the dance, let's allow the dance to happen. When I work in the United States with this Lerman and Dance Exchange, turn discomfort into inquiry.
Yeah.
Put it in the room.
If
So
you actually want
we're at a
people to
place
leave
right
the
now
room.
where
That's
it's an
what you're
invitation. So for everyone who feel that they're marginalized, a person of color, a person who has never been given the space to be in the front, as suggested, then they can now go in the front. It's an invitation for us to have a conversation. It's gonna get messy. It's gonna get murky. But I think in those beautiful moments, we realize the full potential
that's just
of the
wrong.
reason why we're here. All right. So I just wanna also put that out in the room, and it's an invitation for anyone who wants to step forward into that particular space that's been afforded to them to do so.
Thank you, Kevin.
All right. And if then no one takes those space, then of course, please go back and have a seat.
Yeah, I
And
want
that will be dealt with.
Yeah.
Just want to put it in the room. That will also be dealt with.
Okay.
Right? So don't worry.
I want to make sure that we give time to Alica to speak because we don't have that much time. If we aren't feeling discomfort, then the work is not actually being done. So thank you, Wendy, for creating the discomfort and putting it in the room. Okay, so Alica. Alica Hall is Executive Director of NIA Center for the Arts. She has a professional background in strategic communication, but her passion lies in creating safer spaces for artists to create and connect with new audiences. Most recently, she has served as the co-chair of Pride Toronto. Alica is now heading up the development of the NIA Centre for the Arts as Executive Director, Canada's first professional multidisciplinary arts facility dedicated to supporting and showcasing African Canadian artists. She attended York University and majored in International Development Studies.
Thank you. So sorry, my voice is a bit off today. I'm just battling a cold, but thank you all for this warm space. And I wanted to just say a big shout out to my fellow panelists who are amazing and have covered so much, important ground on the history that have really led us to this moment and led, NIA Center to be possible as well. I think that's a huge gap that we have in the sector, is being able to connect with and understand the histories of movements and work that women do in these spaces to advance equity policies, to advance our ability to enter into institutions or not, to advance our ability to have conversations with decision makers. And that work is often invisible, it's not documented, it's not archived anywhere, and it lives within people's bodies and memories. I really like that point that you made, Zainub, about memory. And so these conversations and spaces are so important for us to be able to connect to that knowledge and experience and recognize how it informs our ability to move forward in our own work. So I just want to thank all of you for that. This notion of being provocative. For me, NIA Center's existence is radical. I recently had the opportunity to go to Europe for a leadership conference. And I, it started in Belgium, and I, tacked on some travel to Paris and to London, and really my goal was to seek out spaces that were prioritizing and centering and showcasing Afro-diasporic art. And it was very difficult to find them. I was, not shocked, but expected that there to be a bit more, considering the long presence of Black people in those countries. And so in London, they were a bit further ahead and had Autograph, which is a art gallery that is run by the Black Association of Photographers. But in Paris, I really actually couldn't find very much. There was just like a new gallery that had just opened, and two galleries that I went to that I expected to find it were actually closed. So, being able to connect with artists there, I just recognized how internationally Black bodies are erased, are underrepresented, are undersupported in the arts landscape. And so NIA Center, being on the brink of creating something that's a first in Canada, is also a center that's very important in the international contemporary landscape for the arts. Our folks to the South in America and in America have a lot more support and resources, and some more institutions, notably the Smithsonian African American Museum that opened up last year. But that's again after 100 years of existence in that country. So, I think what I'm focusing on today is really just talking about NIA Center's genesis and what are some of the questions and ideas and considerations that we're moving forward with and exploring. I have far less answers and mostly questions that are informing my work every day. But I do want to thank folks for highlighting a number of points, and I'll skip over them because I think that the conversation and generative conversation that we're having here is so important. So first I wanted to just, speak a bit about NIA Center's genesis. So we were born out of the Youth Challenge Fund, which was a fund set up in 2006 after a spate of shooting gun violence in the city, where a number of young Black men died. And so most of the funding was allocated to young people working and living in priority neighborhoods, and really formulated on, their own ideas of what their communities needed to be able to address racism, to be able to inspire a generation of youth and create infrastructure in those neighborhoods. But there was a recognition that the arts are such an important part of Black life, an important part of struggle, an important part of being able to connect to oneself and understand oneself, particularly in a diaspora, and that there wasn't a space in this city that has the largest amount of the African diaspora in Canada. And so how could we build a space that could properly reflect and showcase art and the artistic traditions that make up this very diverse community? So it was conceived as a legacy project, so one that would not just support youth, but people of all ages and ethnicities from the African Canadian diaspora. And so with the focus on it being a space, there was a long search to find an appropriate location, and we're now located at 524 Oakwood, which is just south of Eglinton West. And if folks are familiar with Toronto, you'll know that Eglinton is very much the heart of particularly the Caribbean community in the 60s and 70s, where many new immigrants from the Caribbean landed and came to sort of live as their first homes. My dad is one of those people, and when I told my stepdad that I was working on a project at 524 Oakwood, he's very spatially oriented, so he was like, he lives in Brampton now, but he was like, do you work at a club? Yeah, actually, it used to be a club in the 80s. I see what you were doing, but it's now, going to be an art center. So, as people come to the building, I'm always just very grateful that we're in a space that has a familiarity to them, it is a point that they, can remember as part of their childhoods or growing up, or, can say, I used to go to Gary's and get my, my hair cut, and they have this sense of connection in that neighborhood. And more recently, the building, I also think about its site as has historically being a site for cultural production in that sense. That club was owned by 2 Black men. It's been a bowling alley in the past, all kinds of things. But it has, served as a point for the community to gather. And that's really important as we think about how we create spaces that harness that energy, that harness that ability for Black bodies to connect. So now we're undertaking this project of renovating what is a former Toronto Public Health building. That's what it was most recently used as. And we're creating a performance space, so there'll be a multidisciplinary performance space. There'll be artist studios. There will be a recording studio, a digital media lab, a full back of house for the theater space, an event space, and am I missing anything else? An exhibition space, of course. And, I think for us, we're thinking about how this space functions as a hub, a real place where artists and communities can gather, where folks can be able to access affordable spaces to present their work, where they can create on site, where they can, question and reason, and also be able to experience artistic works from a variety of Afro-diasporic traditions. Because I think the really unique thing about Toronto is that the Black community is very, very diverse. So when Karen talked about, organizations thinking about equity, even though they're culturally specific, it's so critical because yes, even Eglinton West being a site very much for the Caribbean, right? It's now also an emerging neighborhood where we see East African communities locating and starting to open up businesses. But Toronto is unique in that we have people from all over the African diaspora. So we have East Africans, we have South Africans, we have West Africans, we have folks who are Muslim, we have folks who are queer, we have folks who are from the Caribbean, from Latino communities. So there's so much diversity that we have to think about how does this space begin to encompass and reach and build on the traditions and values of these different communities within this, and how does this site become a place where people can locate themselves within the works that are presented and developed here. So that's really something that we're thinking about as we develop programming, as we develop outreach strategies, is being able to not center the experiences just on those primarily Caribbean folks who, and Anglo, all sorts of traditional things, but Caribbean folks who have come to sort of Canada first in that way. And so that, from that, there are a series of questions that we're continuing asking, who is not engaged and who isn't here and why? And how do we serve artists from different traditions? And what does this notion of traditional mean within our context? How does indigeneity show up? Right? Because folks who are from certain African countries as well consider themselves indigenous to the lands that they're connected to. What is our relationship to the indigenous community here, and how is that reflected in the center? How does this space function as a site of cultural production and also cultural preservation, recognizing that there are traditions that are at risk of being lost, right? We think about even traditions that are, often on display but not well understood. Carnival, for example, being one. What are the roots of Carnival and how does that live within this space and how does it manifest here? And then we also have to think about the neighborhood, right? The neighborhood is also changing. We don't exist in this vacuum. We want to be able to serve our local neighborhood, and community for us is twofold in that sense. It's about local residents. It's also about a larger, larger Black and Afro-diasporic community. And the neighborhood is one that is, there's the Eglinton Crosstown that's going in, so the neighborhood has been under construction basically for like 3 years, and there's a threat of another 2 years, I think. And so it has brought a lot of disruption and the inevitable but threat of gentrification. And so how does this site then respond to and as well preserve the cultural legacies of creative entrepreneurship, of Black presence in this neighborhood that we know is under threat? And then there's our interface with the contemporary arts landscape, the rest of the arts ecosystem. For me, in speaking with so many artists and hearing what some of their barriers and challenges are, I feel like, one of the key things that really stood out to me as well is this notion of erasure. Black artists have been erased, period. We brought together a series of conversations between, or a couple conversations that were intergenerational in nature. And it was really interesting to hear how, artists were first perceived when they came to Canada and tried to, seek funding, tried to seek out spaces to present their work. I remember hearing from an elder who's a dancer, and him speaking about calling, the Ontario Arts Council and seeking out funding for his production, and them saying, well, you didn't go to school for dance, so you don't really fit into the professional arts category. Your school is not accredited here, and it's not really community dance either. So I don't think that you're going to be eligible for this funding. And he talked about getting off the phone and being like, I don't understand, and calling them back and going and having a meeting and, still being told that your practice is not valid. It's not valid because its traditions are not classical. It's not valid because, in this contemporary royal dance, we don't see it. And those stories, I feel like when we talk about equity and we talk about the underrepresentation of art, people of color, Indigenous art, we are not specifying how these institutions have systematically said, no, this is not legitimate. And I think that's an important part of the conversation, an important part of how institutions as well are held accountable, because the equity framework is brought out and everyone's all excited, there's a new pot of funding, but it's not, the clarity around that is just, to me, not really there, and it's important for people to understand that. There's a conversation that we had around the economic development and culture and the equity framework there, and it's a great framework. Really points to where change needs to happen, and also again, sitting down with staff, it's we need a couple more years to figure out how we actually quantify this. We need a couple more years to actually set these benchmarks, and so the ability for us to know these stories, to know these histories of how people have been systematically shadowed is so important for us to be able to advocate, because there's so much still work to do in working with these institutions and really not seeking permission to, or not being able to point to an equity framework, but really being able to say, we're here creating work and it's not being validated, it's not being showcased, it's not being promoted, and that's what NIA Center really wants to be able to do, is create that platform for Black arts and culture and create an ability for us to be able to archive and house those works so that people can refer to them as they're looking at creating new works, because really the erasure has resulted in a cessation of Black cultural production. It's difficult for artists today to be able to say, what was someone producing 25 years ago? Those artists are there, they produce the work, but it's not documented anywhere, it's not readily accessible, and so that really puts a pause in the ability for Black cultural production to happen on a continuum and happen on an ongoing basis. So we need to build an organization that both raises people up, that opens doors, that builds capacity. We're recognizing that because folks have been erased, they have been, they're widely underrepresented in terms of funding opportunities and in terms of presentation opportunities, that it results in a whole generations being lost. Artists stopping work, artists, ceasing to produce work because it's just not able to be supported. And so it's really important for us as an organization to think about how we both uphold that work and ensure that the reference material is available there for folks to see and access. And then I also think about this space, it's really critical for our space to be able to be, to center the voices of Black people, to create a space where Black people can connect. And there's so much magic and importance in that. And I also think about questions that I often ask myself about, where do non-Black allies fit in? Where do non-Black people fit in as audiences and consumers? Because I feel like there is this gap between, the work that's being created, the themes that are being presented, important discussions that are happening, and the people who should be there as well to hear them and participate in them are not there. So there's an importance in creating spaces for Black people where we can actually not have to code switch and not have to validate our work and not have to legitimize what we're doing. But then there's also an importance of non-Black people and allies being able to come to the table and consume those pieces. And it's something that, as I've sat with other arts, leaders and artists, there's this conversation about, who isn't at the table, and do we have a responsibility to reach people who don't agree with us? And who don't understand the work that we're doing and why we believe it's important. Where do they fit into that equation? Are they, a lost cause, or are they people that need to be brought along this continuum? And it's something that, I struggle with. I think back to my days of communications work, and I've primarily done communications with, nonprofits and hospitals and organizations that are helping to change people's lives. And, I think of one of my directors who would say, there's certain people, Alica, you're not talking to them. They're gone. Like they're not people that you're going to reach. And that I also question that notion. What is that threshold, and where do we where do we put effort and where do we not, right? And part of it is related to this burden, right? This notion of capacity, this notion of continuously having to show up and be the only one, the only voice in the room that's advocating, and how exhausting it is. And part of it is also about holding other institutions accountable to participate in that conversation and push those dialogues forward. It can't just be the NIA centers and the folks who are on this panel who are very much doing that work on a day-to-day basis. We need to be able to engage folks who are on different sides, have different perspectives, but be able to still generate a progressive conversation. And I think it's so important because that's what's leading to this polarization. And I think, that's another topic for perhaps another day. But, critical dialogue can't happen in a vacuum. It can't happen, with folks who already believe the same thing. And so I know that's definitely one of the conversations that we continually have is, how do you engage those folks and into how much effort do you extend into that conversation? Because it is quite exhausting, but I think it's an important part of, building organizations and spaces that we're continually investing in folks who are at the table because they believe that change is needed. And if we just cut people off, then, who's left, right, as part of that audience. So I think I will leave it there because I feel like we have a lot to talk about, but yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Is Kevin still here? No.
He just steps out
Oh,
shortly.
I'm just checking on time. It's 12:30 that we have till?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So, questions from the audience again?
12:15, and then we have a poetry reading.
Okay.
I have a question. 1, 2, 3. Based on the 4 conversations or the 4 sets of information that we were given today, could any of you ladies give some form of cross-sectionality where you can see yourself sharing with one another based on your institutions you're working in, and how a small idea of what that may look like in terms of sharing knowledge across the board or giving a helping hand towards one another?
I feel like everyone has made such important points, and for me, really reaching out to elders is such an important part of my work. Not that anybody is an elder that didn't want to be, but the history is just like really key. Being able to talk about, because I think when we start work and we're working with institutions, it always seems like you're starting fresh and you're making an argument about the past, right, and what's happened historically. But when you can talk about, like, with concrete dates, times, policies, conversations, it's much more helpful to create that sense of urgency around the fact that this has been going on. We've, had this conversation. This organization has come in and, had this conversation. So how do we now hold folks accountable, recognizing that this isn't the first time we're doing this, right? So for me, really, like, being able to sit down with Zainub and, have conversations about the work that she's done, the work that she is now doing, becomes very helpful when we're now approaching other, subsequent organizations. And art, we've done an art fair this year, and, we're looking at use of galleries to present work. Like, there's real synergies in being able to both understand the context of what's happened and the work that women have done to advance the conversations that we want to have, the policies that we want, the directions we want to go in. And so just that context is so important, I think. And so, yeah, I would welcome an opportunity to sit down with everybody. This equity framework, I'm citing it all the time when I go and sit down with the city and talk to them. And I think that being able to know not just the report that's online and where the city has indicated that they want to go, but also the conversations that didn't make it to the report, right? And there are, of course, as always. So there are points where they said, we didn't really want to go there, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so when you know that, you're able to say, I know this isn't in the report, but the person who developed the report or the framework was developed with the intention to X, So all of that context is really helpful because, again, it helps us hold institutions accountable.
I think there's a huge opportunity to work together in the way that you just posed the question. And in real sort of practical terms, just to go from what Alica was saying, like, I would be really happy to host a workshop or mentor on, how do you create new policy frameworks? How do you fight to change existing ones? How do you, how do you organize, right? How do you organize to come together in solidarity? I mean, these are real practical things that can be taught at so many levels, or in the galleries if it's a Gary context. There's so many ways, I think. But I think what happens is that the will is there, but we go back into our incredibly busy lives, and then unless we really can come together in sort of a formal way of creating that exchange, the goodwill is there, but then it gets lost. But I do think that maybe we could start something from this conversation and do something that, can allow for that type of cross exchange.
I don't have a lot to add. I think we've talked a lot about solidarity in the room, and I'm a huge supporter of solidarity. I think that there is a very tight, there's a tightness in terms of, because there are only a certain amount of women in the sector who are in positions of any kind of leadership. I think we do naturally gravitate towards each other, and we do create opportunities for partnership. And it's also kind of a support system, because sometimes when you're feeling very isolated within an institution that's predominantly, particularly if you're working in an institution that's predominantly not of color or not Indigenous, you are looking for those connections. And so I feel like it's something that organically happens, but I think Zainub is also right that it has to, we have to make sure that we put the time and the energy to have those moments of intersection, and I mean, I feel every time, like when Marjorie and I don't know each other very well, we've met a few times, but when Marjorie was hired, I felt like that was a personal, like I was so joyous. I mean, like every time something like that happens, I feel it's such a point of celebration for me, like sometimes I will even cry. Like, and people will be like, what is wrong with you? But it's because working in this community or working in the sector, when I see other women experiencing that success and having that kind of recognition, it makes me really, really emotional and really, really happy, because I do feel we are a community.
I don't know, I don't have anything else to add to that, except that I feel like the opportunities to connect, because for women who are leadership roles, we never have that time. We never carve out that time. I haven't met you before. I haven't met Zainub before, and I'm looking forward to the other women that I'll meet today. And so it's that opportunity to connect is really maybe something that as an industry we need to, to think about. How can we do this more often where we're in the same room together, right?
I would just say the time and resources are really hard. Like, I think that I find it really interesting how much organizations are able to collaborate, because I find it very resource intensive. And so I think you do need to actually create support around it to facilitate those relationships, because it's like collaboration, makes us so much stronger, but you need to actually, it needs to be formal to actually happen and, be an intentional part of the organization's activities.
I would say in the theatre sector in Canada, we're starting to form some conversations of just women of color in leadership roles across Canada. So even if that means, for us so far, it's been scheduling times that we have it all Skype in and we all Zoom in, so that we just have these conversations, and that's only been quarterly so far. But we're looking at the kind of first few ones of where we're trying to meet nationally and getting resources to do that, just to meet. And that seems, I just to stress that to be in the room is something where those conversations can happen, and frankly where burdens can be shared, and so then those struggles can be affirmed and gives us strength to move forward.
I'm going to go back to something that earlier, I just feel like I need to say that, like, when we moved around and some people left and so forth, I think one of the ingredients to success around equity that I didn't mention in my list, which is maybe the most important one, is the ability to delve into the uncomfortable and into the murky and into the troubled and into the challenged spaces. And it's for those who got up and ceded their position and moved around, I have to say I respect that, because that discomfort, that there may be that moment of discomfort, but to get to the next place, we need to have those tricky moments, because these are the kind of lived experiences that people have had for generations. And I just wanted to sort of say that I think the ability to confront and have a dialogue, even when it's uncomfortable, is really, really important, I think. Kevin?
I'm calling my privilege as a male in the room. I see men in the back, I'm stepping back. I just want to pick up on that point, Karen, and say that we're going to end about 12:10, and 5 minutes for that particular conversation, and also give voice where spaces were silenced. So I want to just do the reflexive conversation in that, and I'll probably just lead that sort of facilitation for 5 minutes around that thing, because I think, yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience at this point? Yeah.
I think we kind of have to address what just happened in the room, and the fact that we have two empty chairs in the room.
Our ancestors are in those chairs.
So I will be reading a little piece of fiction that will make a lot of people uncomfortable as well. I get into fiction writing because I want to tell uncomfortable truth. But at the same time, I do fundamentally disagree with the approach to alienate anyone who want to be allies to this movement. I really don't think our movement will go anywhere if we only talk among ourselves. That's my fundamental belief. And I really do think people who come to this room out of their own volition, devote this amount of personal time to do this, they clearly are interested in becoming an ally and helping us move our mission forward. And I just do not think it's a good approach to show any amount of not welcoming or even putting them on a target in some ways. I think strategically it's not a good approach, and also emotionally we're supposed to have everyone come in as human beings. A person does not need to qualify. My parents are immigrants. That's why I can be in this space as well. I don't think it should ever be needed. I understand all the history. I'm an immigrant myself.
About excluding people in the room is about who are we centering physically and emotionally and spiritually in this room. And we live in a society that is a white space. We work in institutions that are white spaces. This is an opportunity, given that it is called literally the gathering, Indigenous Black people of color, to center, women specifically, to center those folks physically here. And part of working in allyship is to give up your space. We have panelists who have talked about giving up power, ceding power. That is both in big and small ways. I just wanted to ensure that, for women of color, Indigenous women, Black women in this space, that they feel that they are physically centered and spiritually centered in this space. And so I did not necessarily exclude people. I said, will you give up your space for those who we are centering today? That means you're not necessarily not in the room, you're just not physically in the center of the space. That's what I was aiming to do, because, as I said, I came today because I was looking forward to a space that did that centered Indigenous, Black, racialized women. So I think if you are truly working in allyship, you understand what it means to give up power and to listen and to actually physically do that as part of that process of allyship.
Can I just say something? I just want to say that I appreciated you saying that, and I personally was more than happy to cede my seat in that situation. And I think that I personally learned through discomfort. I think going into somewhat positions that maybe make me or other people feel uncomfortable is a position for learning and a position for building understanding. I just wanted to add one piece of context, is that we were invited to come to the front when we came in at 9:30. We were actually told, please sit in the front. I would not know. We actually originally sat at the back. So I just wanted you to know that context. Like I wouldn't have chosen to sit there. But I think that what you said at the top is right. What you said, I want to be provocative, and I appreciate that you being, really putting something out there in a new kind of way, because I think, I personally had no problem with just so you're aware.
No, I appreciate that context because I did not know that.
Mm-hmm.
And, provocation is to encourage discomfort. And so when the panelists are asked to be provocative, who are they being provocative for? As I said, everything you've described, women of color, Indigenous women, Black women have lived this.
There's no provocative.
And so it's not provocative. So the provocation is for those who do not identify as Indigenous, Black, and people of color as women. And so I just want to reclaim physically this space so that we are speaking to and creating community, the very community that you're saying that you don't have time to create. And when you see someone elevated to a position of power, that you cry because it is your win too. It's literally creating the space to do that. So thank you for that context. I appreciate it.
There is something that there are also around though, people who present white who are not white, or what whiteness is in a North American context than it is in a Southern context. And I think that was part of the, and I don't know if, I don't want to give space to her to speak, but that was sort of the challenge
I
I
actually
was having.
to bring that.
Because of cultural identities and also country identities also related to some emotion. And I also want to say that as program manager, turning this conflict into inquiry is also about empathy. So this is really a space of now understanding what elicits in reactions in someone else, but also how we, as I said to someone, I'm not going to silence the voice of a marginalized person in this particular space who spoke about that. But that also elicited reactions from what we hope is a very inclusive space. That includes also understanding that we're not all at the same place with our work in equity, diversity, or inclusivity, or pluralism. And so we can call out to call in, and we can do that, so it can be a really coordinated effect. I also want to just have, through courage and strength and confidence, and through our own set of facilitation, we were in a conversation about it. Because this CPAMO space, for those who are always intersecting with it, has always been a welcoming one, and it's always been one where I talk about non-judgmental relationships in space. I love the decentering because I'm Jamaican, I love to push back. So thanks for the pushback. Did you want to?
Sure. It's Gundy, right? Gundy.
Yes.
So I agree. I understand everything you just said, and one of my questions is, where do you draw the line on? Sorry, that's bad. So, like, people of color is a very open word. If you're talking about visible people of color, and if this space, and your claim was to put visible people of color in the center of the room, and I understand that, and I understand all of the privileges that I carry as white Passe. I am Brazilian. I'm actually mixed Brazilian, and I've been here 5 years. So it's like I've done a lot of work to understand all of the privileges I have as someone that passes as white. And I always, people assume I'm Canadian, people assume I have Canadian citizenship, people assume a lot of things. Until I say like, no, I'm a Latina, whatever. And it's hard to find spaces when you are in those intersections. So what do we do with the intersections? That's basically my question. In this conversation, what do we do with the intersections? And I completely understand what you were doing. I appreciate how provocative you were doing. It did make me emotional, mostly because I'm one of those weird intersections, and I never know where to stand.
I also want to just to echo what Kevin said and respond to you. I'm also mixed race, and I also have a disability that's invisible. So I think when we talk about intersectionality, I want to go back to your comment about assumptions, right? And know that sometimes you might have an assumption about what you visibly see, but there's a lot of stuff happening that you might not see, right? And I think we need to think about that. And I had a question on my list that kind of connects a lot of what everyone was saying and brings back our criticality to power and what's preventing our utopian idea of diversity and equity. And I think that when we think about neoliberalism, which you brought up, and we think about taking risks, the thing that's happening right now, I find, in Ontario is this, the clawback of arts funding means that, and this is a very deliberate neoliberal policy, right, means that philanthropists and private corporations have to come in to fund what used to be funded publicly. So I had a question on my list about how do we as organizations fund the projects that we want to fund when endowments are coming from white spaces of power, extremely elite white spaces of power. So we're talking about the 1%, the 2% of Toronto that come into our organizations and offer us extreme amounts of money. But with that offer, there's a contract, and they often get to say where that money gets spent and how it gets spent. And so as a person who works in the arts sector now, what I see is the biggest power struggle is that. It's that now maybe we have all these diversity and equity frameworks in the public sector, but we're having to go get money from people who don't care about that and are telling us we want our money in the classics, which is what you said, right? And we don't want to take risks with our $500,000 on that, because I don't know what that is. And we have to take the money because we need it so desperately that our organizations might fold. So for me, like, that's where my head is right now. How do we do these amazing, amazing productions and art exhibits when I think that this is the big...
Two stories that I heard in the last few months, let's say. One was, I don't even remember the name of the artist. I turned on the radio, I'm like driving to get a train, and it was clearly a black musician, and the whoever that morning person was going, and so tell me like about your music, like what do you play, blah blah. Anyway, this person must have said in a space of 5 minutes at least 3 times, but I come from a really good family. Which white musician do you know has to defend their family's honor on a national radio program? Okay, I was like, I parked the car. I was so angry. I was like, why is this black person having to do this? Okay, now another one, some South Asian dude had got this big diversity and inclusion job in his big firm, and he was like, no history of struggle, no history of anything. We are also fighting people of color who are not ideologically and class aligned with us. They are the most dangerous because they are the ones being brought in and they don't think they're carrying any burden. The art world at the moment, I think, is doing the visual art world is doing some really interesting things because they are really questioning dirty money. These are the people who sit on boards and give millions and millions of dollars to the Met and the MoMA and the Whitney, and so you can see that this challenge is happening. If you've read the Booker, you know that prize was just shared with Margaret Atwood. If you've read the Turner Prize yesterday, those 4 artists said, we don't want this competition. We're in a democracy. We want to change this. And so you're seeing this all over the world, and I think that's why when I spoke, I think that we really need to understand the biggest capitalist, modernist, neoliberal conditions which are forcing us to behave the way that we do. And we need to break that, and that's the knowledge that we need to build and organize around. And not easy to do. But it's even great that in this little gathering that we're having this conversation, because a year ago I felt so frustrated because I feel even a year ago we weren't there. But the world is changing, right? And so I think Canada has a moment and we should seize it. for really like fighting what we have to. I mean, I know this is being recorded, so I'm also being but you know, I mean, we need to organize against Ford government,
Put it up there.
right? We do. We that's where I think we have to start questioning. To your question.
Yeah, I just want to add to that I think what I love about today's conversation, although I know it's not really that provocative because we've gone through all of these conversations for the last 100 years, but nonetheless, I like the fact that there's an element of radicalism which is coming back, an element of real activism, because what Zainub said is really important, which is it seems like institutions love finding brown bodies who are willing to just sort of fit in nicely into the system. When you come in and actually you start to really fundamentally question the whole way that an organization's operating, as I said, particularly as a woman, you often get sidelined. And so I love the idea, I love Marjorie's provocation. I loved your talk about, erasure and so forth. Like demanding space and really radically changing the way our institutions work is really where we need to go. Not just getting in and it's like letting the systems stay the same because now we're in. It's like, no, that's not enough. It's like once you're in, you got to fundamentally change the entire system. That's my feeling.
Yes, I'm just riffing off that point, not on the original point. It's like that, the kind of dangerous brown body is like the brown body that gets is on the ladder for the helicopter and then pulls the ladder up, right? And I think everyone's like, oh yeah, I know that person. And the opposite of that is like the person that gets on there and goes, okay, let's take this helicopter, let's take it around and get this ladder out, and how many people can we get in here? How many people can we save? Or, like that's the opposite image that I came up with. So that to me it's like the ideal leadership. In an artistic leadership, I've always articulated that my job is like any kind of artistic leadership or as a mentor is like to make myself obsolete. And one of my mentees was here, but it's like to make myself obsolete. How can I create the systems? How can I create the situation? How can I support people so that then I'm not needed anymore? And I think that's part philosophically where I stand in terms of how, when we have that position of power, what we can do to be able to hopefully change that in the future.
I just wanted to also say one last thing about a little bit about what happened in the room. Like I'm also mixed race, and I have to say that I think it's wrong not to acknowledge that. I don't like essentialism, and I think because I think there is so much intersectionality, but at the same time, the darker your skin, the more racism you experience, and if you do not acknowledge that, it's really a problem. I am a woman of color. I will cede my position to a black woman because she experiences what I experience tenfold. So likewise, Indigenous women, because of the incredible racism and cultural genocide that has occurred in this country. So I will take a back seat in any context to black women and to Indigenous women for that reason. To me, as a mixed race woman, that is sort of part of what I see as my responsibility, and to acknowledge that even though it's not a competition of oppressions, that some people actually do experience more oppression on a day-to-day basis than others. I just wanted to throw that out.
And I want to contribute to that to say that there's two acronyms, BIPOC, and if you know this is IBPOC. There's no way I'm going to put the black reality in front of the indigenous reality, but the black is next. And then people of color because of that particular point. And again, it's a language about also how we're actually having these conversations and what it means and who arrives in the room to actually have them. That is a part of the broadening context of why we're here. I enjoy that it went that way. I think part of the Canadian problem is this idea of activism. We stand behind these words, but we're not active behind them. and allies and or persons, people of color, IBPOC, or indigenous, what is the activism that we could do, and in particular that is needed for women to be the sector of change that we know is potential across the country. I want to also mention that as program manager, the title of this panel is very specific, because there's a whole thing about cultural relativity, culturally relative policies, and sometimes maybe part of that policy is then actually having settler bodies arrive not in the spaces of power that they do. But that's a whole other thing around policy and everything we won't need to get into.
Let's finish.
Alica, and then we have 3 minutes to wrap this up before I introduce.
You finish. Yeah. Oh, wow.
No, I think I was just musing about the complexity of it, right? Is how one presents, and also the intention of spaces that we create, right? Because I feel like I do often struggle with seeing folks who are at the forefront of movements and don't have that experience of having to physically be in spaces. And then this was very apparent to me when I was in Paris, of like walking on the Champs-Élysées or being in the Pompidou and people like just looking at me. Like I was like, wow, this is very real and not, what I typically experience even in, in a city like Toronto. So that, the differences in how your body is accepted or not accepted or externalized or otherized in different spaces is very real. And, there are people at the forefront of movements who don't have those experiences every day. And, you do question and wonder how they arrive sometimes, or why they're elevated to talk about, experiences that they don't, live with every single day. But I do think that there is, this importance of understanding the intention of a space, and whether the space is about gathering to learn from one another and, share in that struggle and, be alleviated of burdens that you share because of that, or if the space is about learning and exchange and ideas, and how we center voices within that. So I think, there is this importance of understanding why we've created a space and how it's realized in the activities and the expressions and the ideas that we bring forward, and ultimately always be working to figure out how do we advance justice, how do we advance policies, ideas, ideologies, activities that advance justice. And they are small activities and there are large activities, but I think, to me the most important thing is that we can take a step that leads to change, always. So.